Why even bother? The importance of motivation. If from the meditative perspective, everything you are thinking is already here, even if it is difficult to wrap your thinking mind around that concept, if there really is no need to acquire anything or attain anything or improve yourself, if you are already whole and complete, and by that same virtue so is the world, then why on earth bother meditating? Why would we want to cultivate mindfulness in the first place? And why use particular methods and practices if they are all in the service of not getting anywhere anyway, and when, moreover, I've just finished saying that methods and practices are not the whole of it anyway? The answer is that as long as the meaning of, quote, everything you are seeking is already here, end quote, is only a concept, it is only a concept, just another nice thought. Being merely a thought, it is extremely limited in its capacity for transforming you, for manifesting the truth the statement is pointing to, and ultimately changing the way you carry yourself and act in the world. More than anything else, I've come to see meditation as an act of love, an inward gesture of benevolence and kindness towards ourselves and towards others, a gesture of the heart that recognizes our perfection even in our obvious imperfection, with all our shortcomings, our wounds, our attachments, our vexations, and our persistent habits of unawareness. It's a very brave gesture to take one's seat for a time and drop in on the present moment without adornment. In stopping, looking, and listening, in giving ourselves over to all our senses, including mind, in any moment, we are in that moment embodying what we hold most sacred in life. Making the gesture, which might include assuming a specific posture for formal meditation, but could also involve simply becoming more mindful or more forgiving of ourselves, immediately reminds and rebodies us. In a sense, you could say that it refreshes us, makes this moment fresh, timeless, freed up, wide open. In such moments, we transcend who we think we are. We go beyond our stories and all our incessant thinking, however deep and important it sometimes is, and reside in the seeing of what is here to be seen and the direct, non-conceptual knowing of what is here to be known, which we don't have to seek because it's already and always here. We rest in awareness, in the knowing itself, which includes, of course, not knowing as well. We become the knowing and the not knowing, as we shall see over and over again. And since we are completely embedded in the warp and woof of the universe, there is really no boundary to this benevolent gesture of awareness, no separation from other beings, no limit to either heart or mind, no limit to our being or our awareness, to our open-hearted presence. In words, it may sound like an idealization. Experienced, it is merely what it is, life expressing itself, sentience, quivering within infinity, with things just as they are. Resting in awareness in any moment involves giving ourselves over to all our senses, in touch with inner and outer landscapes as one seamless whole, and thus in touch with all life unfolding in its fullness in any moment and in every place we might possibly find ourselves, inwardly or outwardly. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master, mindfulness teacher, poet, and peace activist, aptly points out that one reason we might want to practice mindfulness is that most of the time we are unwittingly practicing its opposite. Every time we get angry, we get better at being angry and reinforce the anger habit. When it is really bad, we say we see red, which means we don't see accurately what is happening at all. And so in that moment, you could say we have lost our mind. Every time we become self-absorbed, we get better at becoming self-absorbed and going unconscious. Every time we get anxious, we get better at being anxious. Practice does make perfect. Without awareness of anger, or of self-absorption, or ennui, or any other mind state that can take us over when it arises, we reinforce those synaptic networks within the nervous system that underlie our conditioned behaviors and mindless habits, and from which it becomes increasingly difficult to disentangle ourselves if we are even aware of what is happening at all. Every moment in which we are caught by desire, by an emotion, by an unexamined impulse, idea, or opinion, In a very real way, we are instantly imprisoned by the contraction within the habitual way we react. Whether it is a habit of withdrawal and distancing ourselves, as in depression and sadness, or of erupting and getting emotionally hijacked by our feelings when we fall headlong into anxiety or anger. Such moments are always accompanied by a contraction in both the mind and the body. But, and this is a huge but, there is simultaneously a potential opening available here as well, a chance not to fall into the contraction, or to recover more quickly from it if we can bring awareness to it. For we are locked up in the automaticity of our reaction and caught in its downstream consequences, i.e., what happens in the very next moment in the world and in ourselves, only by our blindness in that moment. Dispel the blindness and we see that the cage we thought we were caught in is already open. Every time we are able to know a desire as desire, anger as anger, a habit as habit, an opinion as an opinion, a thought as a thought, a mind spasm as a mind spasm, or an intense sensation in the body as an intense sensation, we are correspondingly liberated. Nothing else has to happen. We don't even have to give up the desire or whatever it is. To see it and know it as desire, as whatever it is enough. In any given moment, we are either practicing mindfulness or de facto, we are practicing mindlessness. When framed this way, we might want to take more responsibility for how we meet the world, inwardly and outwardly, in any and every moment, especially given that there just aren't any in-between moments in our lives. So meditation is both nothing at all, because there's no place to go and nothing to do, and simultaneously the hardest work in the world, because our mindlessness habit is so strongly developed and resistant to being seen and dismantled through our awareness. And it does require method and practice and effort to develop and refine our capacity for awareness, so that it can tame the unruly qualities of the mind that make it at times so opaque and insensate. These features of meditation, both as nothing at all and as the hardest work in the world, necessitate a high degree of motivation to practice being utterly present without attachment or identification. But who wants to do the hardest work in the world when you are already overwhelmed with more things to do than you can possibly get done? Important things, necessary things, things you may be very attached to so that you can build whatever it is that you may be trying to build, or to get whatever it is that you're trying to get, or even sometimes just so you can get things over with and check them off your to-do list. And why meditate when it doesn't involve doing anyway, and when the result of all the non-doing is never to get anywhere but to be where you already are? What would I have to show for all my non-efforts, which nevertheless take so much time and energy and attention? All I can say in response is that everybody I have ever met who has gotten into the practice of mindfulness and has found some way or other to sustain it in their lives for a period of time has expressed the feeling to me at one point or another, usually when things are at their absolute worst, that they couldn't imagine what they would have done without the practice. It is as simple as that, really, and that deep. Once you practice, you know what they mean. If you don't practice, there's no way to know. And of course, probably most people are first drawn to the practice of mindfulness because of their suffering, because of stress or pain of one kind or another, and their dissatisfaction with elements of their lives that they somehow sense might be set right through the gentle ministrations of direct observation, inquiry, and self-compassion. Stress and pain thus become potentially valuable portals and motivators through which to enter the practice. And one more thing. When I say that meditation is the hardest work in the world, that is not quite accurate unless you understand that I don't just mean work in the usual sense, but also as play. Meditation is playful, too. It's hilarious to watch the workings of our own mind, for one thing. And it's much too serious to take too seriously. Humor, playfulness, and undermining any hint of pious attitude in yourself are critical elements of mindfulness practice. And besides, maybe it is parenting that is the hardest work in the world. But if you are a parent, are mindfulness and parenting two different things? I recently got a call from a physician colleague in his late 40s who had undergone hip replacement surgery, surprising for his age, for which he needed an MRI before the operation took place. He recounted how useful the breath wound up being when he was swallowed by the machine. He said he couldn't even imagine what it would be like for a patient who didn't know about mindfulness and using the breath to stay grounded in such a difficult situation, although, of course, it happens every day. He also said he was astonished by the degree of mindlessness that characterized many aspects of his hospital stay. He felt successively stripped of his status as a physician, and a rather prominent one at that, and then of his personhood and identity. He had been a recipient of medical care, but on the whole, that care had hardly been caring. Caring requires empathy and mindfulness, an open-hearted presence, what I often call heartfulness, often surprisingly lacking where one would think it would be most in evidence. After all, we do call it health care. It is staggering, shocking, and saddening that such stories are even now all too common, and that they come even from doctors themselves when they become patients and need care themselves. Beyond the ubiquity of stress and pain operating in my own life, sometimes in the most rending of ways, as it is with all of us in various moments or life circumstances, my motivation to practice mindfulness is fairly simple. Each moment missed is a moment unlived. Each moment missed makes it more likely I'll miss the next moment and live through it cloaked in mindless habits of automaticity of thinking, feeling, and doing, rather than living in, out of, and through awareness. I see it happen over and over again. Thinking in the service of awareness is heaven. Thinking in the absence of awareness can be hell. For mindlessness is not simply innocent or insensitive, quaint or clueless. Much of the time, it is actively harmful, wittingly or unwittingly, both to oneself and to the others with whom we come in contact or share our lives. Besides, life is overwhelmingly interesting, revealing, and awe-provoking when we show up for it wholeheartedly and pay attention to the particulars, even in our most challenging and unwanted moments. If we sum up all the missed moments, inattention can actually consume our whole life and color virtually everything we do and every choice we make or fail to make. Is this what we are living for? To miss and therefore misconstrue our very lives? I prefer going into the adventure every day with my eyes open, paying attention to what is most important, even if I keep getting confronted at times with the feebleness of my efforts when I think that they're mine, and the tenacity of my most deeply ingrained and robotic habits when I think they are mine. I find it useful to meet each moment freshly as a new beginning, to keep returning to an awareness of now over and over again, and let a gentle but firm perseverance stemming from the discipline of the practice keep me at least somewhat open to whatever is arising, and behold it, apprehend it, accept it to whatever degree I can manage in that moment, look deeply into it, and learn whatever it might be possible to learn as the nature of the situation is revealed in the attending itself. When you come right down to it, what else is there to do? If we're not grounded in our being, if we're not grounded in wakefulness, are we not actually missing out on the gift of our very lives and the opportunity to be of any real benefit to others? It does help if I remind myself to ask my heart from time to time what is most important right now, in this moment, and listen very carefully for the response. As Thoreau put it at the end of Walden, only that day dawns to which we are awake. Aiming and sustaining. A colleague coming off retreat said she thought meditation practice was all about aiming the attention and then sustaining that focus moment by moment. At the time, I wrote it off as being pretty self-evident, almost trivial. Besides, it had too much of a sense of agency to it, I thought to myself judgingly, too much of a sense of doing something and therefore too much reliance on someone to be doing the doing. It took me years for the value of that insight to sink in and to be revealed as fundamental. For just as breathing doesn't necessitate a someone we have to think of as the breather in any fundamental way, although we can fabricate the thought of one, such as, the breather, that must be me, of course, I am breathing. Aiming and sustaining doesn't necessitate someone to do the aiming or the sustaining either, although again, we can artificially make one up and are pretty much bound to do so at first out of our persistent habit of selfing. But really, both aiming and sustaining come about naturally as we become more comfortable and practiced in resting in awareness itself, in what we might call being the knowing. Let's take the breath as an example. Breathing is fundamental to life. It is just happening. As a rule, we don't pay much attention to it unless we're choking or drowning or have allergies or a bad cold. But imagine resting in an awareness of breathing. To do so requires first that we feel the breath and afford it a place in the field of awareness, which is always changing in terms of what the mind and the body or the world offers up to divert and distract our attention. We might be able to feel the breath, but in the next moment it's forgotten in favor of something else. The aiming is here, but there's no sustaining, so we have to aim over and over again. Coming back to the breath over and over again. Every time noticing what is carrying our attention away. The sustaining comes with the intention to allow sustaining. It requires considerable attentiveness to keep the focus on the breath sensations when our attention is so labile, so easily pulled elsewhere. Over days, weeks, months, and years, however, with wise and gentle attention to sustaining and a perseverance in our practice that comes out of our love for a greater authenticity which we sense is possible and perhaps vaguely missing in the conduct and unfolding of our very lives, we come to rest more easily in the breath, in the knowing of it from moment to moment as it is unfolding. This sustaining is known in Sanskrit as samadhi, that focused quality of mind that is one-pointed, concentrated, and if not utterly unwavering, is at least relatively stable. Samadhi is developed and deepened as the normally agitated activity of our minds stills itself through the continued exercise of our ability to recognize when the mind has wandered off the agreed-upon object of attention, in this case the breath, and to bring it back over and over again without judgment, reaction, or impatience. Simply aiming, sustaining, recognizing when the sustaining is evaporated, then re-aiming and again sustaining, over and over and over and over again. Like the fins of a submarine or the keel on a sailboat, samadhi stabilizes and steadies the mind, even in the face of its winds and waves, which gradually abate as they cease being fed by our inattention and our veritable addiction to their presence and content. With the mind relatively steady and unwavering, any object we hold in awareness becomes more vivid, is apprehended with greater clarity. In the early stages, samadhi is more likely to reveal itself as a possible condition of our minds when we're part of a class or a workshop, even more so on an extended meditation retreat when we intentionally sequester ourselves for a time from the usual hustle and bustle of life and its endless preoccupations, obligations, and occasions for distraction, and face the actuality of what is on our minds when it's left alone, relatively speaking. Just to experience such sustained elemental stillness outwardly and the interior silence and relative calm that can accompany it is ample reason for arranging one's life to cultivate and bathe in this possibility from time to time. We may come to see that the waves and the winds of the mind are not fundamental, just weather patterns we habitually get caught in and then lost in, thinking the content is what is most important, rather than the awareness within which the content of our minds can unfold. Once you have tasted some degree of concentration and stability of focus in your attention, it is somewhat easier to settle into such stability of mind and reside within it at other times than on retreat, right in the midst of a busy life. Of course, this doesn't mean that everything in the mind will be calm and peaceful. We are visited over time by all sorts of mind states and body states, some pleasant, others unpleasant, others so neutral they may be hard to notice at all. But what is more calm and more stable is our ability to attend. It is the platform of our observing that becomes more stable. And with a degree of sustained calmness in our attending, if we don't cling to it for its own sake, invariably comes the development of insight, fueled and revealed by our awareness, by mindfulness itself, the mind's intrinsic capacity to know any and all objects of attention in any and every moment as they are, beyond mere conceptual knowing through labeling and making meaning out of things through thinking. Mindfulness discerns the breath as deep when it is deep. It discerns the breath as shallow when it is shallow. It knows the coming in and it knows the going out. It knows its impersonal nature in the same way that you know in some deep way that it is not you who is breathing. It is more that breathing is just happening. Mindfulness knows the impermanent nature of each breath. It knows any and all thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and impulses as they arise in and around and outside each and every breath. For mindfulness is the knowing quality of awareness, the core property of mind itself. It is strengthened by sustaining, and it is self-sustaining. Mindfulness is the field of knowing. When that field is stabilized by calmness and one-pointedness, the arising of the knowing itself is sustained, and the quality of the knowing strengthened. That knowing of things as they are is called wisdom. It comes from trusting your original mind, which is nothing other than a stable, infinite, open awareness. It is a field of knowing that apprehends instantly when something appears or moves or disappears within its vastness. Like the field of the sun's radiance, it is always present, but it is often obscured by cloud cover, in this case, the self-generated cloudiness of the mind's habits of distraction, its endless proliferating of images, thoughts, stories, and feelings, many of them not quite accurate. The more we practice aiming and sustaining our attention, the more we learn to rest effortlessly in the sustain, as when we depress the sustain pedal on a piano. The notes continue to reverberate long after the keys are struck. The more we rest effortlessly in the sustain, the more the natural radiance of our very nature as simultaneously a localized and infinite expression of wisdom and love reveals itself, no longer obscured from others or, more importantly, from ourselves. Presence. If you happen to stumble upon somebody who is meditating, you know instantly that you have come into the orbit of something unusual and remarkable. Because I lead meditation classes and retreats, I have that experience quite often. I look out sometimes at hundreds of people sitting in silence, on purpose, with nothing happening whatsoever except what is happening in the various interior landscapes of life unfolding in the present moment for each and every person there. Someone passing by might think it strange to see 100 people sitting in a room in silence, doing nothing, not for a brief moment, but for minutes on end, maybe even for an hour at a time. At the same time, that person might very well be moved in some way by a palpable feeling of emanating presence that is an all too rare experience for any of us. If you were that person, even if you didn't have any idea what was going on, you might easily find yourself inexplicably drawn to linger, to gaze upon such a gathering with great curiosity and interest, sharing in the energy field of the silence. It is intrinsically attractive and harmonizing. The feeling of an effortless, alert attention behind such sitting in silence without moving is itself overpowering, as is the sense of intentionality embodied in such an assembly. Attention and intention. 200 people present in mindful silence, unmoving, with no agenda other than to be present, is a staggering manifestation of human goodness in its own right. It is deeply moving, this unmoving presence. But actually, I am moved by the very same feeling when I am in the presence of even one person sitting. At any given time, in a room with several hundred meditators, some may be struggling and distracted, working at being present, which is very different from being present if only a hairbreadth away in any moment. Yet it can feel like an infinite gulf when one is thinking or striving or in pain. So inwardly, there can be a lot of going back and forth, in and out of awareness, especially when the stability of one's attention is undeveloped and making for a rocky time of it. Usually this translates into outward restlessness, a wiggling, shifting, and slumping. But in those for whom a degree of concentration is developed, or who are naturally more concentrated and focused, a sense of presence actually emanates from them. A person can appear subtly illuminated from within. Sometimes the peacefulness of a face will move me to tears. Sometimes there is the slightest of smiles hanging absolutely still in the passage of time, not the smile of ha-ha, not the smile of any subject, but precisely in that moment the absence of a subject. It is plain to see. No longer is the person just a person or a personality. He or she has become being, pure and simple, just being, just wakefulness, just peace. And in being peace, in that moment, the beauty of the person as pure being is unmistakable. I don't need to actually see any of this to know it. I can feel it with my eyes closed, sitting up front facing the retreatants, or on retreat myself, surrounded by other people all sitting in silence in a room for about an hour. I feel the presence and beauty of those in front of me or around me far more than if we were in conversation. Even though many may be in pain or struggling, their very willingness to be in the discomfort and open to it brings them into this field of presence, the field of mindfulness, of silent illumination. When school teachers call attendance in classrooms around the world, the children, in whatever language, respond by saying the equivalent of present, by which everybody agrees tacitly that yes, the child is in the classroom, no mistake about it. The child thinks so, the parents think so, and the teacher thinks so. But much of the time, it's only the child's body that is in the classroom. The child's gaze may be out the window for long stretches, perhaps years at a time, seeing things that no one else is seeing. The child's psyche may be in the dreamland of fantasy, or if the child is fundamentally happy, only incarnating in the classroom occasionally because she has more important karmic work to do. Or the child may be dwelling unbeknownst to all, hidden in a nightmare of anxiety, plagued by demons of self-doubt or self-loathing, or numbing turbulence, the likes of which cannot be voiced in those kinds of settings, if ever, and which make presence and concentrating on tasks nigh impossible when the child's world is one of being consistently and regularly, or for that matter episodically, abused, disregarded, or neglected. Tibetans use the term Kundun when speaking of the Dalai Lama. Kundun means the presence. It is neither a misnomer nor an exaggeration. In his presence, you become more present. I have had the occasion to observe him on multiple occasions over a period of days in a room with a small number of people, often with complex scientific conversations and presentations going on, varying naturally in degrees of interest. But he appears to be right there all the time, not just in his thinking, but in his feeling tone. He attends to the matter at hand, and I've noticed that all of us around him become not only more present, but more open and more loving just by being in his presence. He interrupts when he doesn't understand. He ponders deeply. You can see it on his face. Closeted with scientists and senior monks and scholars, he regularly asks pointed questions during their presentations, to which a frequent response is, "Your Holiness, that is exactly the question we asked ourselves at this point, and the next experiment we decided to do." He may sometimes appear distracted, but usually I'm fooled if I think so, because he stays right on point. But he does often look deep in thought, puzzled, or pondering a point. In the next moment, he can be very playful, radiating delight and kindness. You could say he was born this way, and that is a whole other story, of course, but these qualities are also the result of years of a certain kind of rigorous training of the mind and the heart. He is the embodiment of that training, even though he would modestly say it's nothing, which is also more than passingly correct. When asked why people respond to him so warmly, he once replied, "I have no special qualities. Perhaps it is because all my life I have meditated on love and compassion with all my strength of mind. Apparently, he does that for 4 hours every morning, no matter what the demands of the coming day are or where he is, and again, for a brief time at the end of the day. Imagine that. To be present is far from trivial. It may be the hardest work in the world. And forget about the maybe. It is the hardest work in the world, at least to sustain presence. And the most important, when you do fall into presence, healthy children live in the landscape of presence much of the time. You know it instantly, feel at home instantly. And being home, you can let loose, let go, rest in your being, rest in awareness, in presence itself, in your own good company. Kabir, the wild ecstatic poet of 15th century India, revered by Muslims and Hindus alike, has a ferocious way of framing the calling of presence and how easily it can escape us. Friend, hope for the guest while you are alive. Jump into experience while you are alive. Think and think while you are alive. What you call salvation belongs to the time before death. If you don't break your ropes while you are alive, do you think ghosts will do it after? The idea that the soul will join with the ecstatic just because the body is rotten, that is all fantasy. What is found now is found then. If you find nothing now, you will simply end up with an apartment in the city of death. If you make love with the divine now, in the next life, you will have the face of satisfied desire. So, plunge into the truth. Find out who the teacher is. Believe in the great sound. Kabir says this, when the guest is being searched for, it is the intensity of the longing for the guest that does all the work. Look at me, and you will see a slave of that intensity. A radical act of love. In its outward manifestation, formal meditation appears to involve either stopping, by parking the body in a stillness that suspends activity, or giving oneself over to flowing movement. In either case, it is an embodiment of wise attention, an inward gesture undertaken for the most part in silence, a shift from doing to simply being. It is an act that may at first seem artificial, but that we soon discover, if we keep at it, is ultimately one of pure love for the life unfolding within us and around us. When I am guiding a meditation with a group of people, I often find myself encouraging them to throw out the thought, I am meditating, and just be awake with no trying, no agenda, no ideas even about what it should look like or feel like, or where your attention should be alighting, to simply be awake to what is in this very moment without adornment or commentary. Such wakefulness is not so easy to taste at first, unless you are really in your beginner's mind. But it is an essential dimension of meditation to know about from the very beginning, even if the experiencing of such open, spacious, choice-free awareness feels elusive in any particular moment. Because we need to get simpler, not more complicated, it is hard for us at first to get out of our own way enough to taste this totally available sense of non-doing, of simply resting and being with no agenda, but fully awake. That is the reason that there are so many different methods and techniques for meditating, and so many different directions and instructions, what I sometimes refer to as scaffolding. You might think of these methods as useful ways of intentionally and willfully bringing us back from the myriad of different directions and places in which we may be stuck, dazed, or confused, of bringing us back to utter and open silence, to what you might call our original wakefulness, which actually was never not here, is never not here, just as the sun is always shining and the ocean is always still at its depths. I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing, and nothing happens. Nothing. Silence. Waves. Nothing happens? Or has everything happened, and we are standing now quietly in the new life? Juan Ramon Jimenez, Oceans. As the pace of our lives continues to accelerate, driven by a host of forces seemingly beyond our control, more and more of us are finding ourselves drawn to engage in meditation, in this radical act of being, this radical act of love. Astonishing as that may seem, given the materialistic, can-do, speed-obsessed, progress-obsessed, celebrity and other people's lives-obsessed, social media-obsessed orientation of our culture. We are moving in the direction of meditative awareness for many reasons, not the least of which may be to maintain our individual and collective sanity, or recover our perspective and sense of meaning, or simply to deal with the outrageous stress and insecurity of this age. By stopping and intentionally falling awake to how things are in this moment, purposefully, without succumbing to our own reactions and judgments, and by working wisely with such occurrences with a healthy dose of self-compassion when we do succumb, and by our willingness to take up residency for a time in the present moment in spite of all our plans and activities aimed at getting somewhere else, completing a project or pursuing desired objects or goals, we discover that such an act is both immensely discouragingly difficult and yet utterly simple, profound, hugely possible after all, and restorative of mind and body, soul and spirit, right in that moment. It is indeed a radical act of love just to sit down and be quiet for a time by yourself. Sitting down in this way is actually a way of taking a stand in your life as it is right now, however it is. We take a stand here and now by sitting down and by sitting up. It is the challenge of this era to stay sane in an increasingly insane world. How are we ever going to do it if we are continually caught up in the chatter of our own minds and the bewilderment of feeling lost or isolated or out of touch with what it all means and with who we really are, when all the doing and accomplishing is sensed as being in some way empty and we realize how short life is? Ultimately, it is only love that can give us insight into what is real and what is important. And so, a radical act of love makes sense. Love for life and for the emergence of one's truest self. Just to sit down and let ourselves drop into presence is a poignant and potent way of affirming that we are slowly but surely coming to our senses, and that the world of direct experience behind all the thinking and emotional reactions and all the self-absorption is still intact and utterly available to us for our succor, for our healing, and for knowing how to be, and when we return to the doing, for knowing what to do and how to at least begin afresh. Awareness and freedom. Have you ever noticed that your awareness of pain is not in pain, even when you are? I'm sure you have. It's a very common experience, especially in childhood, but one we usually don't examine or talk about because it's so fleeting and the pain so much more compelling in the moment it comes upon us. Have you ever noticed that your awareness of fear is not afraid, even when you are terrified? Or that your awareness of depression is not depressed? That your awareness of your bad habits is not a slave to those habits? Or perhaps even that your awareness of who you are is not who you think you are? You can test out any of these propositions for yourself anytime you like, simply by investigating awareness, by becoming aware of awareness itself. It's easy, but we hardly ever think to do it because awareness, like the present moment itself, is virtually a hidden dimension in our lives, embedded everywhere and therefore not so noticeable anywhere. Awareness is immanent and infinitely available, but it is camouflaged like a shy animal. It usually requires some degree of effort and stillness, if not stealth, even to catch a glimpse of it, no less get a sustained look, even though it may be entirely out in the open. You have to be alert, curious, motivated to see it. With awareness, you have to be willing to let the knowing of it come to you, to invite it in, silently and skillfully, in the midst of whatever you are thinking or experiencing. After all, you are already seeing. You are already hearing. There is awareness in all of that, coming through all the sense doors, including your mind, right here and right now. If you move into pure awareness in the midst of pain, even for the tiniest moment, your relationship with your pain is going to shift right in that very moment. It is impossible for it not to change because the gesture of holding it, even if not sustained for long, even for a second or two, already reveals its larger dimensionality. And that shift in your relationship with the experience gives you more degrees of freedom in your attitude and in your actions in a given situation, whatever it is, even if you don't know what to do. The not knowing is its own kind of knowing, when the not knowing is itself embraced in awareness. Sounds strange, I know, but with ongoing practice, it may start making very real sense to you, viscerally, at a gut level, way deeper than thought. Awareness transforms emotional pain just as it transforms the pain that we attribute more to the domain of body sensations. When we are immersed in emotional pain, if we pay close attention, we will notice that there is always an overlay of thoughts and a plethora of different feelings about the pain that we are in. So here too, the entire constellation of what we think of as emotional pain can be welcomed in and held in awareness, crazy as that may sound at first blush. It is amazing how unused we are to doing such a thing and how profoundly revealing and liberating it can be to engage our emotions and feelings in this way, even when they are raging or despairing, especially when they are raging or despairing. None of us need to inflict pain on ourselves just so we can have an occasion to test out this unique property of awareness to be bigger than and of a different nature altogether from our pain. All we need to do is be alert to the arrival of pain when it shows up, whatever its form. Our alertness gives rise to awareness at the moment of contact with the initiating event, whether it be a sensation or a thought, a look or a glance, what someone says or what happens in any moment. The application of wisdom happens right here, at the point of contact, in the moment of contact. Remember the princess who stubbed her toe? Whether you have just hit your thumb with a hammer, or the world suddenly takes an unexpected turn and you are faced with one more aspect or another of the full catastrophe, and all of a sudden, grief and sorrow, anger and fear seem to have taken up what feels like permanent residency in your world. It is at that moment, and in its aftermath, that we might bring awareness to the condition in which we find ourselves, the condition of the body and of the mind and heart. And then we take one more leap, bringing awareness to the awareness itself, noticing whether your awareness itself is in pain, or angry, or frightened, or sad. It won't be. It can't be. But you have to check for yourself. There is no freedom in the thought of it. The thought is only useful in getting us to remember to look, to embrace that particular moment in awareness, and then to bring awareness to our awareness. That's when we check. You could even say that is the checking, because the awareness knows instantly. It may last only a moment, but in that moment lies the experience of freedom. The door to freedom and heartfulness, the natural qualities of our being when we experience freedom, opens right in that moment. There is nothing else to do. Awareness opens it and invites you to peek in, if just for a second, and see for yourself. This is not to suggest that awareness is a cold and unfeeling strategy for turning away from the depths of our pain in moments of anguish or loss, or in their lingering aftermath. Loss and anguish, bereavement and grief, anxiety and despair, as well as all the joy available to us, lie at the very core of our humanity and beckon us to meet them face on when they arise, and know them and accept them as they are. It is precisely a turning toward and an embracing rather than a turning away or a denying or suppressing of feeling that is most called for and that awareness embodies. Awareness may not diminish the enormity of our pain in all circumstances, nor should it. It does provide a greater basket for tenderly holding and intimately knowing our suffering in any and all circumstances, and that, it turns out, is transformative and can make all the difference between endless imprisonment in pain and suffering and freedom from suffering, even though we have no immunity to the various forms of pain that, as human beings, we are invariably subject to. Of course, opportunities large and small abound for bringing awareness to whatever is happening in our everyday lives. And so our whole life can become one seamless cultivation of mindfulness in this regard. Taking up the challenge of waking up to our lives and being transmuted by wakefulness itself is its own form of yoga, the yoga of everyday life, applicable in any and every moment, at work, in our relationships, in raising children if we are parents, in our relationships with our own parents, whether they are living or dead, in our relationship with our own thoughts about the past and the future, in our relationship to our own bodies. We can bring awareness to whatever is happening, to moments of conflict and to moments of harmony, and to moments so neutral we might not even notice them at all. In each moment, you can test out for yourself whether in bringing awareness to that moment, the world does or does not open in response to your gesture of mindfulness, does or does not offer itself, in the poet Mary Oliver's lovely phrase, to your imagination, whether or not it affords new and larger ways of seeing and being with what is, and thereby perhaps might liberate you from the dangers of partial seeing and the usually strong attachment you may have to any particular view simply because it's yours and you are therefore partial to it. Enthralled once again, even when in great pain, with the story of me that I'm busy creating, unwittingly, merely out of habit, I have an opportunity, countless opportunities, to see its unfolding and to cease and desist from feeding it, to issue a restraining order if necessary, to turn the key which has been sitting in the lock all along, to step out of jail, and therefore meet the world in new and more expansive and appropriate ways by embracing it fully rather than contracting, recoiling, or turning away. This willingness to embrace what is and then work with it takes great courage and presence of mind. So in any moment, whatever is happening, we can always check and see for ourselves. Does awareness worry? Does awareness get lost in anger or greed or pain? Does awareness, brought to any moment, even the tiniest moment, simply know and in knowing free us? Check it out. It is my experience that awareness gives us back to ourselves. It is the only force I know that can do so. It is the quintessence of intelligence, physical, emotional, and moral. It seems as if it needs to be conjured up, but in actuality, it's here all the time, only to be discovered, rediscovered, embraced, settled into. This is where the refining comes in remembering, and then in the letting go and the letting be, resting in the words of the great Japanese poet Ryokan, just this, just this. This is what is meant by the practice of mindfulness. As we have seen, the challenge is twofold. First, to bring awareness to our moments as best we can, even in little and fleeting ways. Second, to sustain our awareness and come to know it better and live inside its larger, never ever diminished wholeness. When we do, we see thoughts liberate themselves, even in the midst of sorrow, as when we reach out and touch a soap bubble. Poof, it is gone. We see sorrow liberate itself, even as we act to soothe it in others and rest in the poignancy of what is. In this freedom, we can meet anything and everything with greater openness. We can hold the challenges we face now with greater fortitude, patience, and clarity. We already live in a bigger reality, one we can draw from by embracing pain and sorrow when they arise, with wise and loving presence, with awareness, with uncontrived acts of kindness and respect towards ourselves and towards others that no longer get lost in the illusory divide between inner and outer. Yet to do so, to enact wakefulness, practically speaking, over the course of a lifetime, usually requires some kind of overarching framework that gives us a place to begin, recipes to try out, maps to follow, wise reminders to give ourselves, all the benefits to us of other people's hard-won experience and knowledge. And this would include, when we need them, various ramps into the awareness and freedom that are ironically here for us in any and every moment, and yet at times are seemingly so distant and far from our ken. On lineage and the uses and limitations of scaffolding. If I have been able to see further, it was only because I stood on the shoulders of giants. Sir Isaac Newton. We all implicitly know that there is huge advantage to using what has come before, building on the creative genius and hard work of others who strained the limits of effort and dedication to see deeply into the nature of things, whether these forerunner explorers were scientists, poets, artists, philosophers, craftsmen, or yogis. In any domain that involves learning, we find ourselves standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, and craning our necks to perceive what they, with great dedication and effort, were able to discern. If we are wise, we will make every effort to read their maps, travel their roads, explore their methods, confirm their findings, so that we may know where to begin and what we might make our own, what to build upon, and where new insights, opportunities, and potential innovations lie. Often we are seriously oblivious to the ground we stand upon, the houses we live in, the lenses we see through, all gifted to us anonymously by others. W.B. Yeats recognized our boundless debt to the creativity and labor of those who came before us, and dedicated 4 lines of now immortal gratitude to those he called the unknown instructors, without whose profound yet in some way fleeting, evanescent, and incomparable accomplishments nothing further could be built or known. What they undertook to do, they brought to pass. All things hang like a drop of dew upon a blade of grass. Our ability to talk and think in words is one example of our inability to reach the heights of even our own innate biological capacity by our own efforts alone. We all have the potential for spoken language, but if a human being grows up in isolation from infancy, not learning language through exposure, either through hearing or through sign language, that capacity, it seems, cannot be fully developed later. Large swaths of mental functioning, cognitive and emotional, are arrested, and speech, even reasoning, severely curtailed. The framework is here to begin with, but it needs to be primed, sculpted, shaped, nurtured through immersion in sounds made by humans, exposure to faces making those sounds, to eye contact, to inflection, to relationality with other humans, to their smells as well as their sounds, to a multimodal and richly sensory emotional connection. For the brain wires itself in important ways as a result of experiences, and this apparently needs to happen during a certain window of chronological development for language development to occur. If that window is somehow missed, we will remain mostly mute, with our own natural capacity and its potential flowering simply out of reach, because the interpersonal, relational dimension was not there to hold and sculpt the innate capacity. To take another even more fundamental example, biology itself is utterly historical. New life only comes from old. Life builds on itself. Cells do not spring forth full-blown from non-cellular environments, although it is thought that in the most rudimentary of forms, they in all likelihood evolved originally within a prebiotic environment under vastly different conditions from those we have today, maybe 3 billion years ago. Cellular structure grows. It continually adds to itself, makes more of itself, while maintaining its own organizational integrity. This is called autopoiesis. Some scientists see it as the rudimentary first link between life and cognition, the original knowing of self, if you will. Whether that is the case or not, we would not have new life without a preceding structure out of which it emerges seamlessly in its 3-dimensional molecular architecture. Life is utterly historical. Thus, at every level, from the biological to the psychological to the social to the cultural, there is a fundamental need for what I call scaffolding. We depend on instructions, guidelines, a context, a relationship, a language to venture meaningfully into the wilds of our own minds and the wilds of nature, the cosmos in which we find ourselves, even if we sometimes diverge from the beaten track and forge our own way through uncharted domains. That body of knowledge has been developed, refined, and distilled over centuries and millennia by lineages of those who have come before. Lineages specializing in survival through hunting and gathering, lineages in the domestication of wild plants and animals, lineages in the sciences and engineering and architecture, in the arts, and in the meditative traditions as well. These lineages have bequeathed to us a history of richly developed and hard-won knowledge of certain landscapes, and the skills required for navigating them effectively, distilled and framed in ways that we can build on, but only after we have penetrated and understood the paths others have blazed, their instructions for doing what they did and going where they went, only after we become intimate to at least some degree with the terrain and challenges they described and the solutions they arrived at. This is our legacy in coming to meditation practice. For meditation practices did not arrive in our present era out of a vacuum. Those who came before us, the direct and multiply branching lineages of teachers reaching back to the time of the Buddha and well before the Buddha, provide a roadmap and offering available to us to explore and to take the measure of. These maps can amplify and enrich our possibilities for the inner exploration of the human mind and its potential that we have already embarked upon. As human beings, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have such a legacy available to us, to have such elevated and sturdy shoulders upon which to stand. For while the practices of meditation may seem at first blush fairly straightforward and perhaps even obviously beneficial, the full-scale power of meditative inquiry, the need for a rigorous discipline, the using of one's own life and mind and body as a laboratory for exploration of what is most fundamental to our humanness, the power inherent in a community of individuals who recognize their fundamental interconnectedness in a world of continual change and uncertainty and vulnerability, is a legacy we were not likely to come upon on our own, but one that, gifted to us more as a science of the mind and the heart than anything else, we can participate in and build upon, just as we individually and collectively build upon what came before in other domains of knowledge and understanding. Of course, we know that there are rare, very rare instances of self-taught genius, but even Mozart studied with his father. Even the Buddha practiced in the meditative traditions of the day before charting his own path, beyond what he had learned from others, building on what had come before, inspired, as the story goes, merely by the sight of a wandering renunciate with a radiant and peaceful countenance who passed by him one day. Almost all scientists themselves have mentors, or people who inspired them at one point or another to look and question deeply in perhaps a different and novel way. Even James Clerk Maxwell, who derived what are now known as Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, one of the most colossal achievements in physics in the 19th century, anchored his efforts upon the work of Michael Faraday, who preceded him and shared many of his instincts, if not his mathematical virtuosity. To arrive at his breathtaking insight, describing precisely with 4 pristine equations the propagation of electromagnetic fields through space, Maxwell employed a mechanical analogy, a mental model of turning gears, to explain to himself how these mysterious, never before visualized, incorporeal forces of electricity and magnetism might actually be related to each other. The model was entirely wrong, but it served him as a kind of scaffolding, allowing him to climb to where he was finally able to see, to reach a point where true insight into the nature of the forces he was attempting to understand was possible. The 4 equations he arrived at by climbing the thought scaffold he erected were entirely correct and complete. Maxwell was smart enough to never publish his mechanical model. He had transcended its utility. It had served its purpose. The lawfulness of invisible, intangible electromagnetic fields had been described with utter finality the scaffolding was no longer important. And so it is with meditation. We too can make good use of various kinds of scaffolding, much that we create for ourselves, much that we adopt from those who came before us, both to motivate us and to assist us in coming to know and understand the terrain of our own minds and bodies and their intimately embedded relationship to the domain we call the world. Yet, at a certain point, we will have to transcend the scaffolding, the platforms we have erected to help us to see, if we're going to go beyond our own cognized and inherited models to the direct experiencing of what is being pointed to with instructions, words, and concepts. Excluding rare exceptions, just sitting down for a time to meditate every once in a while, or even regularly for years, is not likely by itself to nurture insight, transformation, or liberation, even though that very impulse is priceless, and the deep faith in one's own fundamental value and essential goodness is critical for undertaking that adventure. As a rule, we need to contextualize our efforts along these lines, yet without getting caught in the narratives that having such a framework and context usually entails. Such meditation narratives would include the notion of a fixed destination. With meditation, cliched as it may seem, as we have been intimating through our emphasis on the present moment and the realization that it is all already here and there is no place to go, it is the journey itself that is most important. The destination, in a very real way, is always here, just as what is discoverable in science is already here even before it is seen, known, described, tested, confirmed, and understood. Recall that Michelangelo claimed that he merely removed what needed removing from a block of marble, revealing the figure that he saw with his own deep artistic eye, that was, in a sense, there from the beginning. Yet without real work, whatever might be here to be revealed in the domains of our own minds and hearts, even though it is already here, remains opaque and of no use to us. It is only here in its potentiality. For it to be revealed requires us to participate in a process of possible revelation, and to be willing to be shaped and transmuted in turn by the process itself. For this reason, it definitely helps to have a map of the terrain we will be entering when we begin meditating, while keeping very much in mind the important and deeply incisive reminder, although again, some might say cliché, that the map is not the territory. The territory of the inner and outer landscapes of our experience as human beings and of our minds appears virtually limitless. Without a map to orient us in our meditation practice, we might very well wander in circles for days or decades without ever tasting moments of clarity or peace or freedom from our own oppressive ideas and opinions and desires. Without a map to orient us, we might also get easily caught by what was just said, perhaps idealizing the promise of a special outcome, caught in illusions and self-deceptions about getting somewhere, attain clarity or peace or freedom in the apparent paradox of it very much sounding like there really is some place to go or get or state to attain. There is, and there isn't. That is why we need to have a map, and why we need to follow the directions of those who have gone before, even while, or especially because, as we shall see further on in more detail, some of those very meditative directions are declaring that there is no map, there is no direction, no vision, no transformation, no attainment, and nothing to attain. Moreover, strange as it may sound, our motivation for practicing also needs to be entered into the equation, so that we don't go astray through an aggressive, acquisitive, striving attitude that is capable of unwittingly causing harm to ourselves or others along the way. Confused at this point? Not a problem. Suffice it to say that you are likely to find it helpful to know something of the road you are treading and its vagaries as reported by those who have traveled it in the past and mapped it out to whatever level of resolution they have managed in their own brief encounters with the infinite, just as it's a good idea to know how others have approached scaling Everest or any other mountain, rather than just going up trusting to luck and one's own good intentions and judgment in the moment. It helps. No, it's absolutely critical to be equipped, outfitted, not merely with gear, but with information and knowledge that comes from the experience of others, with maps, and beyond that, to the degree that it's transferable, which it is not, but at least intuitable, it's essential to be equipped with your own innate but also informed wisdom. Otherwise, it's all too easy to delude oneself and die needlessly on the mountain. It is hard enough to stay alive, even with all the scaffolding to support you, and important that you not let it and all the details of getting there and surviving the journey prevent you from drinking in the fullness of the mountain's awesome beauty and presence, as well as your own, while you are there. Even getting lost is not necessarily a problem. In fact, it may be an important part of the journey, and it can happen even when in possession of all the best maps. Getting lost and being confused, even making mistakes, are all an integral part of the learning. It's how we make the territory our own, how we come to know it intimately firsthand. Meditation practice, too, invariably requires a certain kind of scaffolding, especially at the beginning, but really always to some degree, only it can grow to seem so second nature that no will or attempt or reminder is any longer necessary, in the form of meditation instructions and a variety of methods and techniques. Such scaffolding also includes the larger context in which one would undertake such a strange, lifelong adventure as to hone your own capacity for dwelling in stillness, for looking deeply into the nature of your own mind, for realizing in this very moment and in all the moments that present themselves the liberative dimensionality of awareness. Just as we need scaffolding to build a building, just as scaffolding was needed for Michelangelo and his apprentices to paint the frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, so we need a certain kind of framework to bring us to the essence of this inner work, right at the edge of this in-breath, this out-breath, this body, this moment. But just as when the building is built or the ceiling completed, the scaffolding is no longer needed and comes down, never having been part of the essence of the endeavor, simply a necessary and useful means for furthering it, so with meditation, the very scaffolding of instructions and framework is dismantles itself really, and only the impalpable, wordless essence remains, that essence being wakefulness itself, before thinking even arises. What makes it interesting is that meditative scaffolding is needed in every moment, and by the same token, it needs to be dismantled in every moment, not later at the end of some great work such as the Sistine Chapel, but moment by moment. This is accomplished by knowing that it is merely scaffolding, however necessary and important, and not becoming attached to it, letting it be erected and dismantled moment by moment. With the Sistine Chapel, the scaffolding may need to be kept in storage or resurrected for touching up, for restoration, for repair or fine-tuning over the years. But in the case of meditation, the masterpiece is always in progress and at the same time always complete in each moment, like life itself. Put another way, proper instruction allows meditation to serve as the jumping-off point right from the beginning into what the Tibetans call non-meditation, even if it may only be a mysteriously opaque device at first, a mere suggestion to keep in mind for later. For even the very thought that you are meditating is scaffolding. That scaffolding is helpful in aiming and sustaining your practice, yet it is also important to see through it to actually be practicing. Both are operative simultaneously moment by moment as you sit, as you rest in awareness, as you practice in any way beyond the reaches of the conceptual mind and its ceaseless proliferations and stories, even, or we could say especially, your stories about meditation. This very book and all books on meditation and all meditation teaching, lineages and traditions, however venerable, all CDs, downloads, apps, podcasts, and other aids to practice are basically also really only scaffolding. Or to switch images, fingers pointing at the moon, reminding us not only of where to look, but that there is something to behold, to see. We can fixate on the scaffolding or on the finger pointing, or refocus to directly apprehend what is being pointed to. The choice is always ours. It is extremely important for us to know this and remember this from the very beginning of our encounter with meditation, so as to not lose ourselves in or find ourselves clinging to the merely conceptual, to an ideal or to a particular teacher or teaching or method or instruction, however enticing and satisfying any of that may appear to be. The risk of unawareness in this domain is that we might build up a convincing story about meditation and how important it is for us, and fall into that narrative rather than realize the essence of who and what we actually are in the only moment we ever have to realize it, which is never some other moment. Ethics and karma. Of course, even scaffolding needs a foundation upon which to rest. It's not very wise to erect it on shifting sands or on dirt or clay that could easily turn into mud. The foundation for mindfulness practice, for all meditative inquiry and exploration, lies in ethics and morality, and above all in the motivation of non-harming. Why? Because you cannot possibly hope to know stillness and calmness within your own mind and body, to say nothing of perceiving the actuality of things beneath their surface appearances, using your own mind as the instrument for knowing, or embodying or enacting those qualities in the world, if your actions are continually clouding, agitating, and destabilizing the very instrument through which you are looking, namely your own mind. We all know that when we transgress in some way, when we are dishonest, lie, steal, kill, cause harm to others, including through sexual misconduct, when we speak ill of others, when we stimulate, dull, or pollute our own minds by abusing substances such as alcohol and drugs out of our own unhappiness and desire for some relief from our pain, the consequences are invariably destructive, causing untold harm to others and to ourselves, whether we know it or not, and whether we are beyond caring or not. Among the consequences of such actions is the certainty that they cloud the mind and fill it with various energies that prevent calmness, prevent stability and clarity, and the enlivened, deep-seeing perception that can accompany such clarity. They take their toll on the body as well, tending to keep it chronically contracted, tense, aggressive, defensive, full of the effects of anger, fear, agitation, and confusion, and ultimately isolation, and in all likelihood also full of grief and remorse. For this reason alone, it's important to examine how we are actually conducting our lives, what we are actually doing, what our actual behavior is, and to be aware of the downstream consequences of our thoughts, words, and deeds in the world and in our own hearts. If we are continually creating agitation in our lives and causing harm to others and to ourselves, it is that agitation and harm that we will encounter in our meditation practice, because that is what we are feeding in ourselves. If we hope for a degree of peace in our own mind and heart, it's only commonsensical that we will benefit from no longer feeding those harmful tendencies and behaviors. In this way, just by forming the intention to recognize and back away from such impulses, we can begin to shift over from unhealthy, what Buddhists quaintly but accurately call unwholesome and destructive mind states and actions, to healthier, more wholesome, and less clouded mind states and body states. Generosity, trustworthiness, kindness, empathy, compassion, gratitude, joy in the good fortune of others, inclusiveness, acceptance, and equanimity are qualities of mind and heart that further the possibilities of well-being and clarity within oneself, to say nothing of the beneficial effects they have in the world. They form the foundation for an ethical and a moral life. Greediness, attempting to take for oneself what's not freely given on any and every level, being untrustworthy and dishonest, unethical and immoral, cruel and full of ill will, riven and driven by self-centeredness at the expense of others, by anger and hatred, and lost in confusion, agitation, arrogance, and addiction. All these are qualities of mind that make it difficult to lead a life of inward satisfaction, equanimity, and peace, to say nothing of the harmful repercussions they have in the world. But mindfulness allows us to work with such mind states rather than to merely deny them or suppress them or continue to give vent to them. When we are visited by such energies, we can actually bring our awareness to them, and rather than be entirely consumed, examine them and learn from them about the sources of our suffering, feel and see the actual first-hand effects of our attitudes and actions on ourselves and on others, and experiment with the possibility of letting these very mind states become our meditation teachers and show us how to live and how not to live, where happiness lies and where it is nowhere to be found. What in the East is known as karma is basically the mystery of how our actions in the present wind up influencing what transpires downstream in time and space for ourselves and for others. Whatever we have done in the past, the law of karma, of cause and effect, says that it will have inevitable consequences in the here and now, some subtle, some gross, some understandable, some not, some even imperceptible, all modulated by our original motivation and intention, the quality of mind that gave birth to the action in the first place. That can include, of course, as frequently happens, having no idea what our motivation was behind a particular thing that we did or said, because we were so caught up in the moment in an agitated state of mind, we literally did not know what we were doing. The past may be behind us, but we carry with us the accumulated consequences of what has already happened, whatever they may be, including perhaps remorse for past decisions and actions, or resentment for what happened to us that we were unable to prevent or control. Yet with appropriate effort and appropriate support and scaffolding, we can also change our karma by coming to the present moment openly and mindfully as best we can, and forming the intention to shift from more afflictive and perhaps destructive to more nurturing mind states and body states. We change our karma in positive ways just by bringing awareness to our motivations, those underlying our outward actions, but also to those inward actions expressed in the body and the mind through thoughts and through speech. By sustaining such an awareness of motivation over time, and by nurturing benevolent motivations and actively avoiding reacting reflexively out of unwholesome motives or total unawareness, in a word, by committing to and actually living an inwardly and outwardly ethical and moral life, moment by moment rather than just in principle, we prepare the ground for deep and ongoing transformation and healing. Without the ethical foundation, neither transformation nor healing is likely to take root. The mind will simply be too agitated, too caught up in its own unexamined conditioning, and in self-delusion and self-destructive emotions to provide appropriate soil for the cultivation of what is deepest, best, and healthiest in ourselves. Ultimately, each one of us is morally as well as usually legally responsible for our own actions and their consequences. Recall that in adjudicating crimes against humanity, such as those perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, or the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, or in Srebrenica, international war crimes tribunals have always found that ultimately, when all is said and done, the responsibility to preserve our humanity sits squarely on each one of us, no matter what our rank or status in society. There are times in which even in the military, disobeying orders takes precedence over obeying them. One reconnaissance helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson Jr., flying over My Lai at the time of the massacre and seeing what was going on, landed his helicopter in the middle of the village and ordered his door gunners to fire on any American soldiers on the ground who continued to kill the women, children, and old men they were in the process of massacring. Ultimately, it is only individuals, each one of us, who can take a stand on the side of human goodness and kindness in the face of the immoral and the amoral and the unethical. Sometimes it may require the kind of dramatic action this 25-year-old Army officer and his two crewmates took. Sometimes it is entirely invisible, simply choosing to act ethically even if you are the only person who will ever know. Or it may take the form of acts of civil disobedience for reasons of conscience, as when one chooses to publicly break a minor law and be willing to suffer the full legal consequences of one's actions, to bring attention to and to protest against actions or policies or laws within the body politic you consider to be immoral and harmful. Both Gandhi and Martin Luther King used nonviolent civil disobedience to great effect in furthering the cause of human rights in the face of endemic and institutionalized cruelty and injustice. Such moral protesters are usually seen at the time by the government in power and often by many onlookers as troublemakers, as disrespectful of law and order, perhaps even as disloyal, unpatriotic, or even enemies of the state. But it could be more accurately said that they are patriots rather than enemies. They may be enemies only of injustice, marching to a different drummer, listening to and entrusting the intelligence of their own conscience, voting with their feet and their bodies, their moral presence bearing witness to a larger truth. Notice that within a generation, they're usually revered, even sanctified. But it is always harder to embody ethics and morality in the present moment, whoever one is, than to celebrate it in others, and usually only after they are long dead, and often murdered. Ultimately, ethics and morality are not about heroes and leaders and shining examples. They are about the day-to-day and moment-to-moment ways in which we conduct our own lives, and what our basic stance is towards those tendencies in our own minds that drive us towards greed, hatred, and delusion, when what we most need is to tap the deeper resources of our own hearts for kindness, generosity, compassion, and goodwill. These are not merely sentimental feelings one might feel all cozy about on Christmas Eve, but truly a way to live, a practice in its own right, and the foundation of healing, transformation, and the possibilities available to us through meditation and through mindfulness. It's worth pointing out that while it's a good idea for these issues to be raised in some fashion from the very beginning of meditation practice, it is also all too easy to fall into a kind of moralistic rhetoric that can sound a lot like sermonizing, and that invariably brings up legitimate questions in people's minds as to whether the person espousing such values actually adheres to them, him or herself, especially since there have been so many instances, including some in meditation centers, where those in positions of authority or power, whether religious leaders, politicians, therapists, physicians, or lawyers, were breaking their own precepts and professional codes of ethics. Such codes of ethics may often be disregarded in the workplace, where rampant abuse of power is sometimes the norm, such as in the rampant sexual misconduct coming to light and finally being named by women regarding Hollywood moguls, movie stars, and television executives and pundits. In the context of teaching MBSR in the stress reduction clinic, we find it most effective and authentic to embody non-harming, open-hearted presence, trustworthiness, generosity, and kindness as best we can as an essential part of our own practice and in how we live and teach and carry ourselves, letting the more explicit conversations around morality and ethics arise naturally out of conversations in which people share in dialogue their experiences with the meditation practice itself, which means with life itself. Attitudes of non-harming and the clear seeing of reactive and destructive mind states and habits are an intimate part of the meditation instructions themselves, and attending carefully to them as we practice together tends to entrain all of us into greater awareness of the benefits of certain thought streams and actions and the dangers of others, including unawareness of power differentials, tacit and unacknowledged assumptions about others, and unrecognized privilege. Ethics and morality are seen, known, and recognized through being lived far more than they are through words, however eloquent. And in a way, as you will undoubtedly see and feel and experience for yourself, they are inherent in the cultivation of mindfulness. By seeing and feeling firsthand, in other words, recognizing for ourselves, the inner and outer effects of our actions, our words, and even our thoughts, our emotions, and our facial expressions, whatever they may be, literally, moment by moment, breath by breath, and day by day. Mindfulness. So, after all this talk of mindfulness, what is it really anyway? According to the Buddhist scholar and monk Nyanaponika Thera, mindfulness is the unfailing master key for knowing the mind, and is thus the starting point, the perfect tool for shaping the mind, and is thus the focal point, and the lofty manifestation of the achieved freedom of the mind, and is thus the culminating point. Not bad for something that basically boils down to paying attention and being awake. Mindfulness can be thought of as moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness cultivated by paying attention in a specific way, that is, in the present moment, and as non-reactively, as non-judgmentally, and as open-heartedly as possible. The non-judgmental part doesn't mean that you won't have any judgments. On the contrary, it means that you will discover that you have tons of judgments, but that you will be more inclined to recognize them for what they are, namely preferences of all kinds, judgments, liking, disliking, desire, aversion. Being non-judgmental is thus an invitation to intentionally suspend the judging as best you can, while noticing how much of it goes on. When it is cultivated intentionally, mindfulness is sometimes referred to as deliberate mindfulness. When it spontaneously arises, as it tends to do more and more the more it is cultivated intentionally, it is sometimes referred to as effortless mindfulness. Ultimately, however arrived at, mindfulness is mindfulness. It is wakefulness, pure and simple. It is awareness. It is open-hearted presence. Of all the meditative wisdom practices that have developed in traditional cultures throughout the world and throughout history, mindfulness is perhaps the most basic, the most powerful, the most universal, among the easiest to grasp and engage in, and arguably the most sorely needed now. For mindfulness is none other than the capacity we all already have to know what is actually happening as it is happening. Vipassana teacher Joseph Goldstein describes it as that quality of mind that notices what is present without judgment, without interference. It is like a mirror that clearly reflects what comes before it. Larry Rosenberg, another Vipassana teacher, calls it the observing power of the mind, a power that varies with the maturity of the practitioner. But, we might add, if mindfulness is a mirror, it is a mirror that knows non-conceptually what comes within its scope. And, not being two-dimensional, we might say that it is more like an electromagnetic or gravitational field than a mirror, a field of knowing, a field of awareness, a field of emptiness, in the same way that a mirror is intrinsically empty and can therefore contain anything and everything that comes before it. Awareness is boundless, or at least it feels that way inwardly, boundless like space itself, with no center and no periphery. If mindfulness is an innate quality of mind, it is also one that can be refined through systematic practice. And for most of us, it has to be refined through practice. We have already noted how out of shape we tend to be when it comes to exercising our innate capacity to pay attention. And that is what meditation is all about, the systematic and intentional cultivation of mindful presence, and through it, of discernment, wisdom, compassion, and other qualities of mind and heart conducive to breaking free from the fetters of our own persistent blindness, self-centeredness, and delusions. The attentional stance we are calling mindfulness has been described by Nyanaponika Thera as the heart of Buddhist meditation. It is central to all the Buddhist teachings and to all the Buddhist traditions, from the many currents and streams of Zen in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, to the various schools of Vipassana or insight meditation in the Theravada tradition native to Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, to those of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism in India, Tibet, Nepal, Ladakh, Bhutan, Mongolia, and Russia. And now, virtually all these schools and their attendant traditions have established firm roots in the cultures of the West, where they are presently flourishing. Their relatively recent arrival in the West over the past 2 generations or so is a remarkable historical extension of a flowering that emerged out of India in the centuries following the death of the Buddha, and ultimately spread across Asia in these many forms, and also returned relatively recently to India, where it had fallen into decline for hundreds of years. Strictly speaking, from an instrumental perspective, the cultivation of mindfulness provides reliable access to our innate awareness. What we are refining is access to awareness rather than awareness itself. The more we can attend moment by moment and non-judgmentally, the more we can dwell in awareness itself, be the wakefulness of awareness. At the same time, from a non-instrumental perspective, mindfulness and awareness are already identical. No development is necessary. Paradoxically, we already have what we are seeking or hoping to cultivate. All that is required is to get out of our own way, which ironically often takes some work. In what follows, we will be using the words mindfulness and awareness synonymously, recognizing that the instrumental and the non-instrumental are themselves not separate, but complementary, interpenetrating aspects of a larger wholeness. What is more, since there is nothing particularly Buddhist about paying attention or about awareness, the essence of mindfulness, both as a practice and as synonymous with awareness itself, is truly universal. It has more to do with the nature of the human mind than with any ideology, belief, or culture. It has more to do with our capacity for knowing, as we have already observed, what is called sentience, than with a particular religion, philosophy, or view. Ultimately, mindfulness is a way of being. It is not a technique, a philosophy, or a catechism. Returning to the simile of the mirror, it is the cardinal virtue of any mirror, small or large, that it can contain any landscape, depending on how it is turned and whether it is clear or covered with dust or dulled by age. There is no necessity to anchor the mirror of mindfulness and restrict it to one particular view to the exclusion of other equally valid inner and outer landscapes. There are many ways of knowing. Mindfulness subsumes and includes them all, just as we might say there is one truth, not many, but there are many ways in which it is understood and can be expressed in the vastness of time and space and the plenitude of cultural conditions and locales. Yet the mirror is a limited metaphor or simile for mindfulness in other ways, even though it is exceedingly useful at times. For not just is it two-dimensional, it is also a reflected image and thus always reversed. When you look at your face in the mirror, it's not your face as it's seen by the world, but the mirror image of it, where left is right and right is left. Being a surface, it does not reflect things quite as they actually are, but renders merely an illusion of such. Mindfulness is valued, perhaps not by that name, but by its qualities in virtually all contemporary and ancient cultures. Indeed, one might say that our lives and our very presence here have depended on the clarity of the mind as mirror and its refined capacity to reflect, contain, encounter, and know with great fidelity things as they actually are. For example, our early ancestors needed to make instant and correct assessments of situations virtually moment by moment. In any moment, their ability to do that could well spell the difference between survival of an individual or even a whole community and extinction. Thus, every person now on Earth is the progeny exclusively of generations of survivors. There was clearly an evolutionary advantage to a mind that could mind what was happening in real time and know instantly that what it knew could be relied upon and acted upon. Those whose mirrors were perhaps somewhat flawed may not have made decisions that effectively ensured their survival long enough to pass on their genes. In this way, there was definite selective advantage to clear mirrors that could instantly recognize and reflect accurately in any matter impinging on survival all the messages coming down through the sense doors. We are the inheritors of that perpetually self-refining selection process. In that sense, we are all above average, far above average, miraculous beings really when you stop and think about it. Over the centuries, the universal inborn capacity we all have for exquisitely fine-tuned awareness and insight has been explored, mapped, preserved, developed, and refined, not so much anymore by prehistory's hunting and gathering societies, which sadly, along with everything they know of the world, are on the verge of extinction brought on by the successes of the flow of human history, such as agriculture and the division and specialization of labor and the rise of cities and of ever-advancing technologies, but rather in monasteries. These intentionally sequestered environments sprang up early in antiquity and have weathered millennia of vicissitudes, all the while renouncing worldly concerns to better devote their energies solely to cultivating, refining, and deepening mindfulness and putting it to use to investigate the nature of the mind with the intention to come to a full and embodied realization of what it means to be fully human and become free from the prison of habitual mental affliction and suffering. At their best, these monasteries were veritable laboratories for investigating the mind, and the monastics who populated them, and continue to do so to this day, used themselves as both the scientists and the object of study in these ongoing investigations. These monks and nuns and occasional householders took for their North Star the example of the Buddha and his teachings. The Buddha, as we have seen, was a person who, for various karmic reasons, took it upon himself to sit down and direct his attention to the central question of suffering, to the investigation of the nature of the mind itself, and to the potential for liberation from sickness, old age, and death, and from what might be called the fundamental disease of humanity. He did this not by denying any of these domains or attempting to circumvent them. Rather, he did it by looking directly into the nature of human experience itself, using as his instrument the capacity we all share, but hardly ever refine to such an extent, for looking into anything in the first place, namely unwavering attention and the awareness and potential for deep and clarifying insight that stem from it. He described himself when asked not as a god, as some would have had it, awed by his wisdom, apparent luminosity, and mere presence, but simply as awake. That wakefulness followed directly from his experience of seeing deeply into the human condition and human suffering, and his discovery that it was possible to break out of seemingly endless cycles of self-delusion, misperception, and mental affliction to an innate freedom, equanimity, and wisdom. Throughout our work together in this volume and the following ones, we will be coming back to mindfulness over and over again, to what it is and to the different ways, both formal and informal, it can be cultivated, all the while hopefully not getting caught in our own stories about it, even as we unavoidably generate them. We will examine mindfulness from many different angles, feeling our way into its various energies and properties, and how they may be relevant to the specifics of our everyday lives on every level, and to our short and long-term well-being and happiness. We will start by taking a closer look at why paying attention is